Snow fell like sifted flour through the pale morning, dusting the wooden bones of Willow Creek Station. A train exhaled steam like a tired beast, its iron lungs wheezing into silence as passengers disembarked, boots crunching frost, skirts brushing the wind. From the last car stepped a man who cast a shadow longer than most buildings in town. Jonas Thorne unfolded himself slowly from the narrow railcar door, as if mindful not to offend the sky. He wore a wool coat faded at the seams and carried a canvas satchel stitched with patches. He stood still for a moment, boots planted firm on the frozen platform, hat low over his brow. The other passengers moved around him like river water around a stone. At 6 feet and 7 inches, Jonas had spent most of his life apologizing without words, ducking through doorways, crouching in carriages, bending to meet eye lines that never held for long. Women in Tennessee had called him a tall order, laughing as they fanned themselves. None had stayed to see if he was worth the reach. But this was the West. This was supposed to be different. He scanned the platform, heart knocking quiet but steady. The letter from Pearl Granger had come with lavender pressed into the fold. She'd written plainly, needing a husband who could lift hay bales and mend fences, someone strong enough to work, quiet enough to keep to himself. Jonas had read it twice a night, the scent of lavender blooming each time he opened it. He imagined her gentle and practical, like a quilt sewn from worn things. He pictured a porch, a dog, maybe laughter shared over stew. He had not expected the face that met him, a narrow woman in stiff blue muslin, arms crossed and eyes climbing him like a ladder she did not wish to climb. Her mouth flattened the longer she stared. "You didn't mention," she said, eyes barely reaching his chest, "that you were so towering." Jonas removed his hat slowly, as if size might shrink with politeness. "Ma'am, I suppose I didn't think it mattered much. I'm able-bodied. I work iron. I don't eat more than a fair man should." Pearl's nose wrinkled. "You'll frighten the horses. I can't have folk thinking I brought in some circus giant." There were people watching, train hands, townsfolk. A boy with a paper bundle paused mid-run. Jonas wished he could fold himself back into that train car, tuck himself into a mailbag, and ride out unseen. "I understand," he said quietly. Pearl huffed, as if he'd inconvenienced her by being what he was. She turned on her heel without a backward glance, her parasol snapping open like a gate slamming shut. He did not follow. For a moment, he simply stood there. The frost crept into his boots, licked at his ankles. The others on the platform began to disperse, life pulling away from his stillness. Jonas looked down at his hands, large and calloused, fingers blackened from coal and hammer. They had mended wagon axles and carved toys for neighbor children. They had once held his dying mother's hand with such care she thought it was her husband returned. But they were not small, not soft, not what was wanted. He walked into town with no destination beyond forward. Willow Creek was modest, a main street of false front buildings, a general store, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left. Above the livery, he found a room for rent from a woman who didn't ask questions. The ceiling sloped low, and he could barely sit upright in the bed. It would do. For the first 3 days, he kept to himself. Cooked beans over a stove that hissed and popped. Repaired a rusted horseshoe in the alley behind the livery just to feel the rhythm of hammer and heat. He passed Pearl once, arm in arm with another man already, laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Jonas only tipped his hat. He stopped checking the post office. There were no more letters. Each night, he unfolded his frame into bed with the care of a man easing into cold water. And each morning, he ducked through the doorway into another day that didn't quite fit him. On the 5th day, the snow melted just enough to reveal the muddy skeleton of the road. He walked to the church out of habit more than hope. His mama had once said that even a silent man could pray loud if he just sat still long enough. The pews were empty save for an old man sleeping near the front, snoring into a hymn book. Jonas chose the back row, careful not to crack the wood under his weight. His knees touched the bench ahead. He folded his hands in his lap and tried to pray for something other than smallness. Halfway through the sermon, latecomers shuffled in. One woman, limping slightly, sat at the far end of his pew. She wore a wool shawl stitched with tiny sunflowers, and her left hand curled stiffly against her side, as if shaped by fire or fall. She did not flinch when she saw him. She did not move away. Instead, she shifted slightly, enough to give him more room, not because she feared him, but because she had noticed. "You look like someone who listens more than he speaks," she murmured, just loud enough for the words to fall between them like soft hay. Jonas didn't reply, but something in his shoulders loosened. After the service, he watched her walk away, cane tapping lightly on the wooden floor, sunflower shawl trailing behind like a banner of quiet resilience. He did not know her name, but her voice lingered. That night, he returned to the forge behind the livery, reopened the firebox, and began shaping iron again, not because anyone had asked him to, but because the rhythm of heat and muscle made sense in a world that often didn't. He thought of the woman's hands, twisted, yes, but graceful still. He thought of her eyes, steady as a level beam. Pearl's face no longer haunted him. It faded like smoke from a blown-out lamp. By week's end, the townsfolk began to recognize him. Some nodded. A boy named Amos watched him with wide eyes, fascinated by the sparks that flew when he hammered steel. The mailman, unused to having nothing to deliver to room 2A, began greeting him by name. Jonas didn't smile much, but he held his head a little higher. And though no new letter came, he began writing one, each night in his mind. Not to Pearl, not to anyone from before, but to a woman who hadn't flinched. To someone who made space without needing a reason. He did not yet know her name, but something told him she'd be back. The spring thaw came slowly to Willow Creek, as if winter had no intention of letting go. Mud pooled in the ruts between buildings and wind still held teeth, but crocuses had begun to nudge through the earth like small, stubborn prayers. Behind the general store, a woman stooped over her garden bed, planting seed with her right hand while her left hung oddly at her side, twisted and half-fused from wrist to finger, the skin pale and ridged like cooled wax. She moved carefully, not because of pain, but precision. She had learned to make do with what remained. Her name was Miriam Calloway, though most in town simply said the widow, with a tone meant to be sympathetic but carried a bitter edge. They remembered the fire more than the woman. 5 years had passed since she dragged a neighbor's child from a burning barn and buried a husband 3 days later, lungs ruined by smoke. Grief had quieted her, not broken her. She stayed, rebuilt, lived on the outskirts of notice, her crooked hand more talked about than her survival. Miriam didn't mind. Silence was a comfort she understood. She first saw him again on a Sunday morning, the tall man in the back row of the church. He ducked under the lintel, like someone stepping into a smaller life. The pew creaked beneath him, knees too long for the space, shoulders hunched, not from pride, but from habit. There's a kind of sorrow about him, not loud, not theatrical, just worn in, like leather softened by weather. She recognized it at once. Some people carry their wounds inside, others wear them in posture and quietness. She sat beside him without hesitation, though there were other rows with room. When their shoulders aligned, he stiffened slightly, then settled. She could feel the heat of him, radiating like coals banked low. "You look like someone who listens more than he speaks," she said, softly, her voice a shade above the hymn's fading notes. He didn't answer, but he turned just enough for her to see his profile, kind, worn, gentle in a way few men allowed themselves to be. She noticed how he kept his hands folded carefully in his lap, the way one might when aware of how large they are. After the service, he stood to go, and she tilted her chin to him in parting. He hesitated, nodded once, as if storing the gesture away. In a town like Willow Creek, no moment passed unnoticed for long. By Tuesday, the storekeeper, Mrs. Deeks, had already cornered Miriam near the flour barrels, whispering over her spectacles. "Man like that? Rejected at the train station, they say." Woman saw him and turned right around. Can't blame her. Looks more like a tree than a man. Men shouldn't grow that big. Bad omen. Miriam placed her sugar on the counter. Maybe trees are just what a place needs when the wind comes through. Mrs. Deek sniffed. "Don't say I didn't warn you." But Miriam wasn't listening. Later that afternoon, she passed the livery and saw him again, shirt sleeves rolled, lifting a wagon wheel with ease and laying it down as gentle as porcelain. A boy with a gap-toothed grin handed him nails. The tall man laughed, low and quiet, and handed the hammer to the child, guiding his grip. Miriam kept walking, but her pace slowed. The next day, a package appeared on her back steps, wrapped in brown cloth, tied with string. Inside, she found a garden trowel, its handle curved to fit the shape of her good hand and the angle of her wrist. It was forged from dark iron, polished at the edges, the grip wrapped in soft leather. There was no note, only care. She sat on her porch and stared at it for a long time, her breath catching like it hadn't in years. It wasn't the gift. It was the fact that someone had studied her hand, her need, and made something that said, "I see you." The next time she saw him, he was repairing the church rail. She walked up without pretense, the trowel tucked into the crook of her elbow. "It fits," she said. He looked up from his work, face shadowed under the brim of his hat. "Good. I didn't ask for it. You didn't need to." They stood in the silence that followed, not awkward, but ripe with unspoken things. She saw the threadbare edges of his shirt, the way he'd reinforced the elbows with mismatched fabric. A man who mended rather than threw away. "I'm Miriam." Jonas. That was all. But it was enough. They began to meet in unplanned ways. She'd walk past the forge, and he'd be there, sleeves soot-darkened, eyes focused. He'd pass by her garden, offer a nod. Once, he lifted a barrel for her, without being asked. She said thank you. He said nothing, but lingered long enough to make sure she didn't fall on the wet porch. They didn't flirt. They shared presence. Which was rarer? One morning, she brought him a loaf of oat bread and left it beside the forge. He carved a handle for her cane in return, shaped to ease her grip when her fingers stiffened. He never asked about her injury. She never asked about the woman who'd turned him away. It was not absence that brought them together, but the quiet weight of endurance. Still, others noticed. Mrs. Deeks saw them walking once. Miriam with her shawl, Jonas carrying a bag of seed. The gossip swelled like summer flies. Poor woman. Lonely does strange things. She ought to know better than to get tangled up with a man who doesn't belong. Her husband's not been dead 10 years. Miriam heard it all. She'd lived too long to mistake pity for kindness. Jonas seemed untouched by it. But one morning, he didn't come to the forge. The fire was cold. The anvil still. That evening, a storm rolled in, wind peeling shingles from rooftops, thunder groaning like a wounded beast. Rain lashed the windows as Miriam sat by the fire, watching the flames with hollow eyes. She rose suddenly, pulled her shawl close, and stepped out into the downpour. Mud sucked at her boots. She walked the length of town, searching, not because she was afraid for him, but because some silences mean more than solitude. She found him at the edge of town, in the half-finished barn beside the schoolhouse. He was shaping wood, shoulders wet through, working as if he didn't feel the storm. "Why'd you disappear?" she asked from the doorway. He didn't turn. "You deserve better talk around your name." "Let them talk," she said. "They always have. I'm not easy to be beside. Never been. Neither am I." That made him pause. She stepped closer. Rain trailed from her hair. "If we're both hard to fit, maybe we make a new shape." Jonas turned then, eyes searching hers not for invitation, but for truth. Whatever he saw, it steadied him. He reached up, touched the edge of her shawl where it clung to her shoulder. "You're not afraid?" "I was once," she said. "Then I walked through fire." The storm cracked above them, wind howling past the open door. But inside the barn, it was warm with something beginning. He didn't kiss her, didn't touch her hand, but he stood beside her, and she didn't move away. That night, the thunder rolled on, but neither of them heard it. Spring took hold slowly, like a lover hesitant to be trusted. The cold no longer bit, but it lingered in the early mornings, curled like breath beneath porches and window panes. Buds began to unfurl on the cottonwoods. The air smelled of wet soil and possibility. Jonas rose earlier now, lighting the forge before the rooster called. The rhythm of fire and hammer steadied him. There was comfort in shaping metal, how it bent beneath heat, how it obeyed quiet persistence. He understood that language, knew how long it took something hard to become something useful. Most days he saw her. Miriam passed with her shawl and her cane, a basket over one arm. She never called out, just nodded, slow and certain, like a woman who knew the weight of silence. She watched the way he worked, and he noticed she never winced at the sparks. Once she brought him ginger tea in a tin cup, still warm. He drank it slowly, though it burned his tongue. There were no declarations between them, no coy glances or fumbled words. Instead, there were shared tasks, fences repaired, stubborn gates re. Miriam's twisted hand did not slow her, but Jonas noticed when it pained her. He offered no help unless asked. Instead, he made things, a tool she could wield with ease, a stool that supported her hip without tipping, a hook for her kitchen shelf placed just at her height. He never mentioned these gifts, left them with the quiet hope they'd be found. She accepted each one like a scripture, a small, ordinary miracle. One afternoon, she sat on the edge of her porch, weeding while the sun warmed her shawl. Jonas approached with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, sweat gleaming along his brow. "You always work that hard?" she asked. He looked down at his hands, knuckles raw. "Work's what I'm made for." "Maybe," she said, eyes narrowing. "But I've seen trees that grow just fine without proving it." Jonas didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth tugged upward. She leaned her cane against the steps and held out the trowel he'd made. The handle, worn now with use, fit her hand like it belonged there. "I think you make things grow, Jonas Thorne. You just don't know it yet." A boy's laughter broke the stillness. Amos, the orphan who shadowed Jonas whenever he could. The child had taken to mimicking the blacksmith's stride, his little boots thudding proudly behind. Jonas had begun teaching him names for tools, letting him fetch nails and stir the fire under watchful eyes. Miriam watched them together, something warming in her chest. She knew loss intimately, but watching those two, man and boy, both lonely in different ways, was like seeing light through cracked glass, distorted but real. In time, their connection wove itself into the fabric of town life. Miriam would leave a jar of salve on the forge table. Jonas would split wood for her stove without being asked. When she fell one morning, slipping on a patch of mud, he appeared without breath or hesitation, lifting her with such gentleness she almost wept. Not from pain, but from being held like she mattered. Still, the town's whispers followed them like dust in sunlight. Mrs. Deeks cornered Miriam again outside the store, voice syrupy and sharp. "You shouldn't give the wrong impression, dear. Folks are talking. That man's strange. Quiet like that's not natural." Miriam tucked her bread under one arm. "Strange isn't the same as unkind." The older woman pursed her lips. "Some wounds don't show until they fester. You do well to remember that." Miriam didn't respond. She was done justifying quiet goodness to those who didn't know how to see it. But later, when she passed the forge and found it empty, worry bloomed uninvited. She waited 2 days before asking Amos, who shrugged and said Jonas was working out by the creek. When she found him, he was alone, shirt sleeves rolled, carving something from cedar. The air smelled of sap and smoke. "You disappear often?" she asked, folding her arms. "I hear things," he said, not looking up. "And believe them?" His hand slowed. "I was told once that I'd never be enough for someone to stay. That's a hard thing to unlearn." She stepped closer, the earth soft beneath her boots. "Maybe you were just waiting for someone with better vision." He looked at her then, truly looked, as if weighing something deep inside. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked. "I've walked through fire," she said. "And I've known men who looked gentle but weren't. You're the other kind." The wood in his lap slipped slightly. He caught it, then held it out. It was a carved bird, wings tucked close, not finished yet. "For the boy," he said. He said he wanted something that could fly. They stood there in the hush between spring winds. Miriam's gaze lingered on the curve of the wings. "You could leave," she said softly, almost to herself. I could, he agreed. But something's growing here. Unseen, maybe. But real. She nodded. Things like that take root slowly. Back in town, the whispers did not stop. Pearl returned one afternoon, riding a new buggy beside a polished man in a bowler hat. Her laughter was brittle, her eyes sharp. She saw Jonas across the street and paused only to offer a tight, mocking smile. I see you found someone desperate, she called, loud enough for Miriam to hear. Jonas didn't answer. Miriam didn't blink. Later, he came to her porch with clenched fists. You shouldn't have to be talked about like that, he said. Miriam poured tea, the steam curling between them. Let them talk. You don't deserve. I deserve what I choose, she said, her voice calm and unwavering. And I choose kindness. I choose this. Jonas sat heavily beside her, knees brushing hers. Sometimes I still feel like I take up too much room in the world. She looked at him, then really looked at the man who bent himself smaller for others, who shaped iron and friendship with equal care, who had never once asked for more than he gave. Maybe the world was just built too small, she said. But you're the right size for the life we're building. They sat in silence, the porch creaking beneath them, the sun dipping behind the hills. And beneath the porch, beneath the frost-softened earth, seeds they had never named were beginning to break open. Roots stretching, reaching. Neither of them spoke of love, but everything they did whispered it. The sky cracked open without warning. One moment, it was late afternoon, the kind of heavy warmth that presses on the skin like held breath. The next, thunder rolled across Willow Creek like a wagon with a broken axle. Loud, uneven foreboding. Miriam stood on her porch, hand wrapped around the railing, eyes on the horizon where clouds stacked like bruises. Wind tugged at her shawl. The scent of rain hit first, then came the cold press of it, sharp drops, sudden and full. She'd grown to love storms, not for their violence, but their honesty, the way they didn't ask permission to shake the world. But this storm was different. She felt it in her bones. Jonas had not come to town in 2 days. Not to the forge, not to the garden, not even to see Amos, who now lingered near the porch in silence, like a dog waiting for its master. No message, no reason, just absence. It was the silence that hurt her most. After all the gentleness they'd exchanged, all the quiet building, he'd disappeared into that same hush again, like he always feared he was too much, and now feared even more that he was not enough. Miriam dried her hands on her skirt and stepped off the porch. The storm was worsening. Rain slicked the roads, turned gutters to streams. Shutters banged against windows. Amos trailed behind her, barefoot, silent. The townsfolk scurried indoors like leaves pulled by wind. Doors closed. Curtains twitched. The world narrowed to wind, water, and her determination. She checked the forge first. Cold. Abandoned. Then the livery. Then the edge of town, near the old barn by the schoolhouse, where he sometimes went to be alone, where no one asked questions, where he could vanish. She found him there, in the open barn, hammering in the rain. He was soaked through, sleeves clinging to his arms, hat discarded, hair dark and plastered. He was building. What she didn't know. A frame, a cart, maybe something meant to carry children or supplies. Whatever it was unfinished. He didn't look up when she stepped inside, just kept working as though the storm hadn't noticed him, or he'd long stopped noticing the storm. 2 days, she said over the rain. He didn't stop hammering. I heard them talk. She stepped closer, water running from her sleeves. And, they're right, he said. You deserve a man who fits in your life, not one who casts a shadow over it. She studied him, the wide curve of his shoulders, the way he never let his full height unfold unless he was alone. A man who had been told since boyhood to make himself smaller, quieter, less. What I deserve, she said, is a man who shows up in the storm. He froze. Slowly, he set the hammer down. I thought maybe if I stepped back, he murmured, you'd be left in peace. Peace isn't absence, Jonas. It's presence that doesn't hurt. Rain lashed against the roof, and the wind howled through the boards like an old animal. Still, the barn held. He turned to face her then, eyes rimmed with something tender. You've lived through fire. You don't need someone who brings more ruin. And you've lived through silence, she said. You don't need someone who leaves when things get loud. For a moment, they simply breathed. He stepped forward, mud sucking at his boots. I've never stayed. Not really. Not when it counted. You're here now. She was soaked to the skin, curls matted to her cheeks, dress clinging to her legs. And still, she was radiant, not in any polished, fragile way, but like river stone, burnished and steady. He lifted a hand as if to touch her face, then hesitated. She closed the distance for him, placing her palm, crooked, weathered, against his chest. You don't scare me, she said. And something in him broke, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a silent collapse of walls long kept. He let his hand rest atop hers, enormous and calloused, trembling slightly. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, something gentler stirred. When they returned to town the next morning, hand in hand, the streets still glistened from rain. Mud clung to their hems. Amos ran to them, grinning wide, and Miriam lifted him without hesitation. Her cane stayed in Jonas's hand. Mrs. Deeks was already out, sweeping the porch of her store. She glanced at them, eyes darting from their clasped hands to the way Jonas stood tall, no longer folding himself in half. Well, she said, folks will talk. Miriam smiled. Let them. Still, the wind had left behind its share of ruin. A tree had split near the church. The bell tower was cracked at the seam. Men were gathering to repair it. Jonas didn't speak, just squeezed her hand once before walking toward them. No one stopped him this time. No one questioned his size or his place. They passed him tools. He climbed the scaffold with ease. She watched him from below, steady, quiet, capable. A man who'd finally stopped shrinking. And in the storm's wake, the town changed. Not all at once. Not cleanly. But subtly. The gossip slowed. The children laughed louder. Even the porch beams stopped creaking when he stood under them. One evening not long after, he brought her to the half-built structure he'd been hammering during the storm. Now finished, it revealed itself, a wagon fitted with low steps, extra storage beneath, padded seats, and a carved rail for someone with a cane to grip. She ran her hand along the polished edge. For the orphanage, he said. So no child has to be carried far. And no woman has to climb alone. She didn't reply with words. Instead, she leaned in, forehead to his chest, the rhythm of his heart steady beneath her ear. I used to think I'd always be alone, she whispered. So did I, he said. The sky was quiet now. No thunder. No wind. Just two people who had withstood both. And somewhere in the earth, roots gripped deeper. Golden light spilled across the valley like warm honey, casting long shadows that danced gently over wheat fields rippling in the wind. It was nearly harvest, the sun thick and low in the sky, and Willow Creek had softened in its pace. There was a kind of hush about the place now, not from fear or weariness, but from a deep, hard-earned peace. Jonas stood at the edge of the orphanage yard, one hand resting on a fence he'd built from split pine. Beside him, Miriam crouched in the dirt, coaxing marigolds into bloom. Her shawl was slung across her back, sleeves rolled, and her crooked hand moved with a grace that had nothing to do with symmetry and everything to do with patience. Behind them, Amos ran across the yard, stick in hand, leading a parade of giggling children in a game that had no clear rules, but brought joy just the same. He called to Jonas, "Pot, look," and Jonas smiled as the word wrapped itself around his heart like a lasso. It still surprised him, sometimes, how easily that name fit now. They hadn't married yet. There'd been no rush. Love for them had taken its time, settling in their bones like the slow warmth of fire. There had been no proposal, just shared days and nights, hands brushing in the hallway, soft laughter over shared bread, the quiet intimacy of people who had chosen to build, not chase. Miriam rose slowly, brushing dirt from her skirts. Jonas offered his arm, and she took it. Her hand, twisted and strong, fit into the crook of his elbow like it had always belonged there. Together, they walked into town. The people of Willow Creek no longer stared. They nodded, offered smiles, sometimes pie. The whispers had turned to warmth, not because the town had changed overnight, but because kindness had outlasted cruelty. That and the fire. The fire had come swiftly, without warning, 2 months after the storm. Lightning struck the church bell tower one dry August night, and flames clawed through the roof faster than hands could bucket water. It was Miriam who saw it first, through her kitchen window. Without hesitation, she'd limped barefoot into the street, calling for help. She didn't wait. She didn't scream. She just moved, toward danger, toward need. Jonas was behind her before anyone else. Inside the smoke, the world had blurred. Screams. Cries. Wood cracking. He lifted 2 children from the pews, found the pastor half collapsed behind the altar. He carried them out one by one, lungs searing, shirt soaked with ash. Miriam stood by the door, coughing but steady, guiding them out with one good hand and a heart full of fire. When the roof groaned and leaned, someone shouted, "Get back! Get out!" Jonas turned once, saw a child huddled in the corner beneath a burning beam, too small to move, too afraid to cry. And he didn't hesitate. He ducked low, arms shielding his head, and pulled the child to his chest. The beam fell. He took the weight across his back. It bruised. It burned. But he didn't fall. Later, when the flames had been beaten down and dawn rose over the smoldering ruin, Jonas emerged from the wreckage, soot-covered and silent, child still in his arms. Miriam met him in the street, tears carving clean lines through ash on her cheeks. She didn't speak, just touched his face with her crooked hand. From that day forward, no one questioned whether he belonged. Now, months later, he built benches for the schoolyard and repaired roofs without being asked. He and Miriam moved through town as partners, he tall and steady, she bent but unyielding. Together, they cast a new kind of shadow, one that offered shelter, not fear. Jonas had carved something special for her. It sat in the garden behind their house, a bench, one side tall, the other short, designed for mismatched lives. When Miriam first saw it, she'd run her fingers along the grain, reading it like scripture. "So no one ever has to shrink again," he said. She didn't cry. She only sat beside him and leaned into his side. That fall, the town held a harvest festival for the first time in years. Children danced, fiddles played, cider flowed. Jonas wore a vest Miriam had sewn from scraps, and she wore her hair down for once, long and silver-threaded. He looked at her like she held the sun. Near dusk, Pearl appeared. Alone this time. She stood at the edge of the festival, uncertain, her dress finer than the air around her. She didn't approach at first, just watched. When she finally stepped forward, Miriam was serving cider. Pearl hesitated, then said quietly, "He seems different now." Miriam looked up. "He's the same man he always was. You just see him now." Pearl swallowed. "I didn't mean to be cruel. But you were. I didn't think he'd ever matter." Miriam's smile held no bitterness. "That's the trouble with only looking down. You miss the things that rise." Pearl nodded once, then left. And that, too, was a kind of healing. That night, as the lanterns dimmed and the children dozed against hay bales, Jonas and Miriam sat side by side on the carved bench. The moon hung low and gold. Wind stirred the wheat fields, and the stars leaned in to listen. Jonas turned to her, voice low. "You still sure?" She nodded. "About you? Always." He took her hand, held it as it was, twisted, perfect, wholly hers. "You gave me roots. You gave me sky." They sat in silence after that, no more words needed. The height of love, they'd come to understand, wasn't measured in breathless confessions or grand gestures. It was found in the steady hands that carried firewood, in the voice that stayed calm when storms came, in the way 2 broken people could lean into each other, not to hold each other up, but to rest. And somewhere, in the quiet soil of all they had endured, something wild and beautiful continued to grow.